Your first step is going to be to get your sketch done. Realize that this is a sketch and not a very detailed drawing. After that, I wanted to mix up a nice yellow. I was going to use that yellow for the background. As you saw in the photograph, it's a very, very light yellow. Since that was a stain, I'm coming over with some white to make it even brighter. In the photograph, that is where the sun is hitting, so it needs to be as bright as it can and to increase the contrast there. After using the white, then I need to go in and use some of the yellow ochre. I'm using this for the main color on the path. On the sides of the path, there's kind of a reddish orange color. So I start out with some red and then add some of the red orange to it. And then I'm going to lighten it up an awful lot with some white. This will give me a good staining to use on that side. Although I will make it darker later. This is a good start. I decided that it was too light, so I added some black to it. Not too much, but just enough to darken it to make it look like a darker brown. Taking the dark green now, and once again rinsing it out and adding some red to it. And this definitely dulls that down. I'm using this dark green for the bushes that are on the sides of the path and there towards the center. I'll come back later and lighten some of these up. Now taking some of that brown, I made some places where the rocks and the stones would be on the sides of the path. I'm using that dark brown again, and this time I'm going to mix up with the black to darken it even more. And finally adding a little bit of blue to cool it down. I'm using this color to start out as a base coat or an underpainting for the shadows of the trees in the front or in the foreground. There's a couple really large trees. And I decided I like that color the same for the middle ground trees as well, the ones that are smaller. Once again, we'll do lots of glazing on these trees to create textures. I took some of the brown and I added some gray to it so I could paint the trees that are in the background. And I decided they were still too dark, so I added some white to that paint and made it even lighter. That's going to be the secret to making these look like they're in the background, and where the sun is shining on them really brightly is to have them be lighter. As the trees come forward, they're going to get darker. Notice that I'm not putting any branches on the trees at this point in time. I will add some of them later, but most of these trees are pretty tall, so the branches are going to be up towards the top. For that tree as well, since it's towards the back in the background, I added more gray to that brown. But this time I'm not adding as much white to it because I want it to be in the middle ground, not in the background. There was a fourth tree that I forgot to put in the background. I was going to leave just 3, but then I decided that that was too much space. There in the foreground, I took some of that darker brown, and now I'm adding some shadows on the stones. When I'm adding the shadows on the stones, I'm making sure to use the side of my brush. And noticing where the sun is coming from in everything I'm painting. This front part in the foreground is really dark, but it's important to build up some of the colors that you're going to see. Using the yellow-green, I'm looking at some of the yellow-green vegetation, some of the leaves, and just adding those to my painting. Painting right over the top of the trees in the background. On many of these I had to come in and do a second glazing or a second layer so that the trees in the background would not show through. I also had to remember that later on I will come in and add some shadows using the darker green. When I'm painting on these leaves that are there, I'm using the tip, actually the side of my flat brush as well as my round brush. Taking the dark green now, adding a little bit of black to it to darken it even more. And I'm adding some shadows to the bushes up in front. Later on, I'll add a third color, kind of a mid-tone. When you're doing shadows, or when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you have your lightest tone, your middle tone, and your dark tone. Here I'm adding a middle tone onto the very light yellow-green, the bushes that are back there in the background. And now I mixed up some more dark green, and this time I lightened it up a little bit so I could use those for the shadows on those trees that are in the background. And also for the leaves on the bushes and the leaves on the trees that are in front. I'm looking very carefully at my photograph when I'm doing this to see how those leaves are laying. Some of them are coming out, kind of making like a little umbrella as they're coming across. So as you're painting leaves, don't just make the assumption that they look the same, because especially on large trees like this, they're all going to look different. You can see how adding all 3 tones the highlight, the darker shadow, and the mid-tone really develop those leaves three-dimensional. Gouache tends to be very flat looking, so utilizing those three will help. Now on the trees that are there, you can see that there's a light side and there's a dark side. I'm coming back in with the dark side and I'm going to build this up a little bit. I started out with just that underpainting, just that staining of that brown, and now I'm coming in with a dark side so that that shadow really shows up. This really helps with not only the shadow, but I can come in and create textures. Create the textures on the tree just by using the tip of my brush and making some lines and utilizing that tip to create those textures that are there. The light that hits these trees is kind of a yellow-green. There you can see the textures developing, and I moved the darker a little bit area because it's just this side, just a little tip side that is hit with the light. But now I'm adding the dark right next to it. There's a tree behind that one, and so it has a shadow on it as well. These are branches that are broken off. They're kind of a characteristic of these trees when you're in a really dark, deep forest. I had to use my medium round, and I made sure that the point was very pointed, and I did not press down at all when I made those branches coming out. I'm coming in and darkening in those areas there in the foreground. And when I did that, you can see how you have the mid-tone, the light tone, and the dark tone all within that dark area. Now, working on some of those stones, I decided to mix up a gray to help them stand out just a little bit more. Once again, a mid-tone, a dark tone, and a light tone. Now working on the path, which was a little bit of a challenge because there's some shadows in here, and then there's some little bitty tiny stones that are on it. With my very small brush, I'm just making some lines going across, and then I have to adjust it a little bit. I'm also adding those little stones. You can kind of see them around the other rocks. Deepening the shadows of the tree that go across the path, adding some more of the texture and some more of the stones that are in the path. Found a couple places where I forgot to put in some dark shadows. And generally around those stones you're going to find a little bit of a shadow right next to where the stone is. Here's some more of those little dots for the little gravels that are on that path. I decided that those gravels were too dark, so I just simply put a damp brush over the top of them, and it kind of toned them down a little bit, but I could still see them. And here's the finished painting.